The gavel slammed down with a force that seemed to tear through the room like a gunshot, not just halting the noise, but crushing the last flicker of hope in a young man's eyes. Towering above in her robe, Judge Bianca Moreau, whose name had become synonymous with judicial harshness, sat like a marble statue, unmoved and unreadable. Across from her stood Julian Cross, just 19 years old, dressed in a suit clearly borrowed for the occasion. He wasn't a criminal defendant. He wasn't on trial. He was a petitioner, a citizen simply asking for his property to be returned. But in Judge Moreau's courtroom, that line between criminal and civilian blurred quickly. She had just dismissed him, waved his plea aside with all the care of someone swatting at a nuisance. Still, Julian didn't budge. The silence that followed crackled with tension, and just as Judge Moreau ready to move to the next case, Julian spoke, 11 words that would not only bring her authority crashing down, but remind everyone of a truth she'd forgotten. The law belongs to all of us, not just the powerful. Dear viewer, before we begin, please write in the comments where you are watching from, and support us with a like and a subscribe. Judge Moreau reigned over Courtroom 4B in Oakmont City Courthouse like a drill sergeant commanding troops. Her docket was notoriously brutal, stacked with civil disputes, petty claims, and property forfeiture hearings. To her, court time wasn't a river that flowed. It was a dam she managed by the second. Every delay was a crack threatening her control. That Tuesday morning, Courtroom 4B reeked of anxiety and cheap coffee. Lawyers in second-hand suits shuffled their papers nervously while clients shifted in their seats, eyes scanning the walls like there might be an exit that didn't lead through judgment. Judge Moreau's eyes, pale and cold like a February sky, swept the room. She prided herself on spotting the essence of a case in half a minute. A shoulder slump, a thumb twitch, that was enough for her. In truth, what she called instinct was a hardened shell that had replaced empathy. Next case, she barked. Docket 2020, CVF 814. Cross versus the State of Illinois. A young man stood up from the rear of the courtroom. Julian Cross was lean, his presence quiet yet intense. The charcoal suit he wore sagged slightly. It didn't quite fit. His briefcase, worn but cared for, had once belonged to his father. As he made his way to the petitioner's table, there was something deliberate in his movement, something that unsettled even Moreau for a moment. He was here alone, choosing to represent himself. That alone sent red flags shooting up in her mind. In her experience, self-represented litigants were trouble, either fringe dwellers spouting anti-government rhetoric or emotionally frayed individuals who couldn't separate personal pain from legal logic. She let out a breath, barely audible. This was going to feel like the longest 10 minutes of her day. On the other side sat Trevor McKay, the assistant state's attorney. McKay wore a permanent smirk and had the self-assured air of someone who'd memorized every loophole in the forfeiture statutes. Civil asset forfeiture was, after all, the state's golden goose, a legal process that let law enforcement seize possessions suspected of being tied to crime, even when no charges were ever filed. McKay knew exactly how to turn that gray area into state revenue. Your Honor, he began smoothly, the state's position is clear. On July 16th, Oakmont police conducted a traffic stop on a 1969 Ford Mustang registered to Mr. Cross. Inside the glove compartment, they discovered $4,800 in cash, bundled with rubber bands, consistent with drug trafficking behavior. Per the Illinois Civil Asset Forfeiture Act, we are petitioning the court for full ownership of both the vehicle and the cash. Judge Moreau turned to Julian. Mr. Cross, is that your understanding of the facts? Julian cleared his throat. His voice, while soft, carried conviction. Yes, Your Honor, but the state has conveniently omitted some key details. Such as, she asked, already sounding annoyed. Such as the fact that I was never charged. No citation. No arrest. The stop was supposedly due to a broken tail light, which wasn't broken. It was a pretext. The money came from selling my grandfather's tools. I've got receipts. I was driving to a classic car show to buy a carburetor for that Mustang. It was my father's car. He passed 2 years ago. I've been restoring it since. His words were straightforward, free of theatrics, but Moreau had already tuned out. She'd heard versions of this before. Emotional stories, heartfelt explanations. Everyone had a narrative. Mr. Cross, she said coolly, this is a civil forfeiture hearing, not a criminal trial. We're not dealing with beyond a reasonable doubt here. The standard is a preponderance of the evidence. She turned back to McKay. Do you have the officer's report? I do, Your Honor, McKay replied, sliding the document over. Officer Miller, a seasoned narcotics veteran, noted the defendant appeared overly nervous and that the cash packaging was a strong indicator of illicit activity. Julian couldn't help himself. Nervous? He snapped. I'm a 19-year-old black man being questioned by 2 armed cops on a dark road. Who wouldn't be nervous? That's enough, Mr. Cross. Judge Moreau cut in sharply, her tone laced with irritation. You will speak when asked. She scanned the report, generic phrases about furtive movements and inconsistent answers. It was copy-paste language, but it didn't have to be specific. In civil forfeiture, vague suspicion often counted as enough. The state didn't have to prove Julian was guilty of anything. They just had to make it seem plausible. The only thing the state needed to prove was that it was more likely than not that Julian's money and car were linked to criminal activity. That's it. Nothing more. In this system, you didn't get the benefit of presumed innocence. You had to claw it back yourself. The report is sufficient, Mr. McKay, Judge Moreau announced with brisk finality. She turned to Julian. Mr. Cross, do you have any legal grounds, and I emphasize legal, not emotional, for opposing this forfeiture? Julian inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He reached into his father's old leather briefcase and retrieved a single, time-worn folder. The corners were frayed from use, but his grip was steady. I do, Your Honor, he replied, his tone calm but resolute. My argument is entirely legal. It's procedural in nature. Across the aisle, Trevor McKay's smirk deepened. To him, a self-represented litigant trying to argue procedural law was like a child trying to perform surgery, misguided and doomed from the start. Judge Moreau leaned in slightly, an eyebrow lifting. There was a trace of morbid amusement in her expression. By all means, Mr. Cross, she said, enlighten us. The room fell into a tense hush. Julian Cross, barely out of high school, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit, standing in a courtroom stacked against him, wasn't just here to reclaim a car and some cash. He was fighting for something bigger, his father's legacy and his own dignity. He laid a document on the table, smoothing it out with care. Though his heart was pounding, his hands were steady. For the past 8 weeks, he'd lived in the dusty corners of the local law library, digging through casebooks and statutes until his eyes ached. One thing had become strikingly clear. Civil forfeiture was a legal maze, and the state often tripped over its own rules. Your Honor, he began, his voice gaining confidence with each word. My argument rests on a violation of the Illinois Controlled Substances Act, specifically Section 505C. That got her attention. Moreau's brow rose slightly. He was citing an actual statute, already more than she expected. And what does Section 505C deal with, Mr. Cross? It sets a timeline for forfeiture proceedings, he explained. The statute requires the state's attorney to file a formal complaint within 45 days of receiving a written claim from the property owner. Now McKay shifted, just slightly. The smirk was still there, but thinner now. I submitted my claim for the return of my property on July 20th, Julian continued, sliding over a certified mail receipt. And that claim was received by the state's attorney's office on July 21st. That puts the 45-day deadline at September 4th. However, Mr. McKay didn't file the complaint until September 10th, 6 days late. A low murmur stirred through the courtroom. No grandstanding, no emotional appeals. Just math and a missed deadline. Judge Moreau narrowed her eyes, glancing at McKay. Mr. McKay, your response? McKay rose, all polished charm. Your Honor, Mr. Cross is referring to an outdated reading of that statute. The 45-day limit is generally treated as directory, not mandatory. A brief delay, caused by a clerical oversight, doesn't harm the petitioner or invalidate the case. He leaned into a well-worn defense. The courts had long made a distinction between mandatory deadlines that voided actions if missed and directory ones that served as guidelines more than law. Illinois judges, particularly in this district, had often looked the other way on minor delays. Moreau nodded. This was the clean resolution she was hoping for, a tidy piece of precedent she could use to dismiss Julian's claim and keep the court moving. Mr. McKay is correct, she declared, her tone sliding into patronizing territory. In this district, the 45-day rule is considered directory. A 6-day delay, while unfortunate, is not fatal to the state's case. Your argument, Mr. Cross, though commendably researched for a non-lawyer, is legally insufficient. It was a wall Julian had expected, but the impact still winded him. He'd seen this argument before in the case law. He had come prepared. But hearing the judge's words, flat, dismissive, absolute, still hit like a body blow. But, Your Honor, he tried again, voice rising. That interpretation has been challenged. There's a new appellate. I am well aware of the law, Mr. Cross, she cut in, her tone going cold. And I don't need a legal lecture from a pro-SE petitioner. You've made your point. It failed. Is there anything else? Yes, there's the case of... Bang. Her gavel cracked through the air like a thunderclap. I asked if you had another argument. Not a continuation of the one I've already ruled on, she said sharply. This discussion is over. Julian froze. He looked at her, then at McKay, who had resumed packing up his briefcase, the smug expression fully restored. He felt the sting of every eye in the room pressing against him. He wasn't losing because he was wrong. He was losing because he wasn't being heard. The courtroom wasn't a maze with rules you could master. It was a locked fortress, and the drawbridge had just slammed shut in his face. Your Honor, he said, voice barely audible. Mr. Cross, Moreau snapped. You are on very thin ice. Do you have any other legal basis for your petition? He had placed everything on that one argument. Airtight, bulletproof. And now it was gone. No, Your Honor, he answered, the words scraping his throat like ash. Very well, she replied, scribbling something in the file. This court finds the state has met its burden by a preponderance of the evidence. The petitioner's objection is noted and overruled in line with current precedent. Therefore, the petition to contest the forfeiture is denied, Judge Moreau pronounced. The 1969 Ford Mustang and the $4,800 in cash are hereby forfeited to the state of Illinois. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Those last two words landed like a blade. With prejudice. In civil law, it meant the door was shut forever. Julian couldn't try again, couldn't refile. It was finished. The gavel came down again. Bang! And it echoed like a gravestone being placed. The car, the fight, the hope, it had all been buried in that sound. Next case, Judge Moreau called, flipping to the next file without a second glance. But Julian didn't move. He stood motionless at the petitioner's table. His hands didn't reach for his briefcase. He didn't lower his gaze. Instead, he remained there, back straight, shoulders squared, staring directly at her. The courtroom froze, caught in that fragile breath between protocol and defiance. He had been dismissed, defeated, stamped out. But somehow he still wasn't done. Judge Moreau, eyes already scanning the next file, looked up and was visibly annoyed to see him still there. In her mind, Julian Cross was a line item she'd already erased. Mr. Cross, she snapped, irritation flaring. Your case is concluded. Please step aside so we may proceed. The bailiff shifted against the wall, sensing something unusual. He was ready to act, but Julian didn't even glance at him. His eyes stayed locked on the bench. That fear he had carried into the room had evaporated, replaced by a calm certainty. He had nothing left to protect. "Your Honor," he said, his voice crisp and suddenly clear, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "May I enter a final statement into the appellate record?" It was a strategic, formal request. Not a plea, not a disruption. Just a procedural motion, a way to get his last words onto the official record should the case go higher. Judge Moreau, clearly annoyed, waved her hand. "Fine. Be brief. The record will reflect your objection." Julian nodded once, then drew a slow breath. What came next would shake the very walls of Courtroom 4B. "The precedent you cited," he began, voice steady and rising, "was overturned 3 months ago, Your Honor." 11 words. And they hit like an earthquake. Across the room, Trevor McKay, already halfway to the door, froze in place. He turned sharply, his face contorted in disbelief. Judge Moreau blinked, confusion dawning, followed by a cold wave of dread. "What did you just say?" she asked, the icy edge of her voice cracking for the first time. Julian didn't hesitate. "The precedent Mr. McKay and this court relied on, that the 45-day deadline is only directory, was explicitly overturned." His voice grew louder, stronger. "By the Illinois Supreme Court, in Dawson v. State of Illinois." From his folder, he produced a crisp, printed opinion, the ruling itself. "Decided June 14th, he continued, placing the paper on the table with calm finality. "The court ruled that the statute's language, 'shall file,' imposes a mandatory jurisdictional deadline. If the state fails to file within 45 days, the court loses jurisdiction. The property must be returned." He had transformed, in that moment, from a teenager in a borrowed suit into something far more dangerous. A man armed with knowledge. A man with the law on his side. Judge Moreau sat frozen, stunned into silence. The name, Dawson versus Illinois, nagged at her memory. It sounded familiar. She should have read it. She meant to read it. But had she grown too comfortable? Too certain she already knew enough? Her gaze darted to her law clerk, Lila Hart, seated just below the bench. Lila's face had gone pale. Her eyes wide. She knew. She'd seen the case. She knew Julian was right. Lila's fingers flew across her keyboard, the frantic tapping echoing in the otherwise silent room. Meanwhile, Trevor McKay had launched into a panic of his own. He dashed back to the prosecution table, fumbling with his tablet, scanning for the case he had clearly missed. His argument, his entire confidence, had rested on precedent that no longer existed. And Julian had just torn it apart. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware of that ruling." McKay stammered, all pretense gone. The smugness had evaporated, replaced by the unmistakable hue of panic. But Judge Moreau didn't hear him. Her eyes were locked on Lila. The clerk slowly looked up from her screen and gave a subtle, reluctant nod. It was real. It was all true. The world tilted beneath Moreau. She, a sitting judge, had just handed down a ruling based on outdated law. She dismissed a petitioner with arrogance. She had mocked and shut down a young man who not only knew the law, he knew it better than she did. And now, every word of her mistake was part of the official record. Julian Cross had not only proven his point, he had proven her wrong. Visibly, publicly, humiliatingly. Her usually stoic expression began to crack. Her cheeks flushed red, not with authority this time, but with shame. Julian stood there, silent now, waiting. His face didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply watched her, quietly waiting for the one thing she had never wanted to give. An admission. She was wrong. The silence wrapped around the room like a fog, thick with tension. Every attorney, every clerk, every bystander felt the weight of the moment. A 19-year-old kid had dismantled the courtroom's authority with the truth. And now, everyone was waiting to see what came next. There was still a way for her to save face. At least, that's what Judge Moreau told herself. She could pause the proceedings, claim she needed time to review recent precedent, and quietly reverse her ruling in a later, less public moment. But the truth was obvious. The damage was already done. It wasn't the reversal itself that hurt. It was the spectacle of it. The exposure. To adjourn now would be to admit, openly, unmistakably, that she had been wrong. And not just wrong. A judge, humiliated by a teenager on the record. She had boxed herself in with her own arrogance. She tried to clear her throat, but all that came out was a dry rasp. Her hand trembled as she reached for her glass of water, the rim clinking awkwardly against her teeth. "Mr. Cross," she said at last, her voice shaky and drained of its usual cutting edge. Would you please approach the bench with that document?" Julian moved forward slowly, his footsteps echoing like drumbeats in the frozen silence of the courtroom. He placed the Dawson ruling on the bench. Morrow didn't reach for it right away. She stared at it like it might strike her. Finally, she picked it up, her fingers stiff with dread. Her eyes swept the page, scanning key phrases with a speed and intensity born of sheer panic. Unambiguous legislative intent. Shall is mandatory. Failure to comply. Divest the court of jurisdiction. Property must be returned forthwith. Each sentence was a blow to the fragile illusion she'd built around herself. He hadn't just understood the ruling. He had cited its key conclusion almost word for word. The paper slipped from her fingers and fluttered back to the bench. She looked out at the courtroom, but her gaze didn't settle on the people. It hovered in the space between, lost in the wreckage of her authority. And then she saw him. In the back row, seated quietly with a laptop open, was Marcus Liu. She hadn't noticed him before, but she knew who he was. Marcus Liu ran the Court Reporter, a sharp, widely read legal blog known for pulling no punches when it came to judges and prosecutors. Her stomach dropped through the floor. This wasn't just an embarrassment. It was going to be a headline. She had to act, had to say something, had to wrestle back whatever control she could. "Mr. McKay," she said, her tone low and grim. "Can you offer this court any reason why we should not immediately vacate its prior ruling, in light of the Supreme Court's decision in Dawson?" McKay looked like he might faint. "And no, Your Honor," he stammered. The state was unaware of the ruling. We concede." His words were limp, broken. He knew this mistake could stain his career permanently. Missing a controlling Supreme Court precedent wasn't just a mistake. It was malpractice. Morrow turned back to Julian. He was still standing there, motionless, dignified. No triumph on his face. No smile. Just quiet expectation. And that, more than anything, shamed her. He had been calm while she was dismissive. He had been right while she was arrogant. And now, he waited, not for revenge, but for the justice he had been denied just minutes ago. "This court," she began, her voice tight and dry, "was operating under what it believed to be settled precedent." The words tasted like rust. It was the closest she could come to admitting fault. "It appears, Mr. Cross, that your legal research was more current than that of both the state and this court." She paused. The courtroom waited. "This court, on its own motion, hereby vacates the prior order entered in case 2025 CBF 0814. Her voice had become flat, mechanical, drained of any authority. "Pursuant to binding precedent established by the Illinois Supreme Court in Dawson v. State of Illinois, this court finds that the state failed to comply with the mandatory 45-day deadline for filing its forfeiture complaint." Her throat tightened as she approached the final blow. As such, this court lacked jurisdiction and continues to lack jurisdiction over the matter. The state's complaint is dismissed, with prejudice. She swallowed hard, then continued. "The Oakmont Police Department is hereby ordered to return the petitioner's property, the 1969 Ford Mustang, and the sum of $4,800 to Mr. Julian Cross. Immediately, without delay." She glanced up one last time. "This court is adjourned." Bang! The gavel came down one final time, but there was no power behind it. It was a hollow sound, a quiet collapse. She didn't call the next case. She stood, her black robes rustling like a curtain being drawn shut, and disappeared through the door to her private chambers, her face carved in stone, an icy blend of shame and fury. The courtroom stayed frozen for a beat. Then, soft whispers filled the air. Trevor McKay didn't wait. He stuffed his things into his briefcase and hurried out, shoulders hunched like he was fleeing a crime scene. Julian Cross remained still for a moment, then calmly gathered his papers. He placed the ruling back into his father's old briefcase, clicked the latches shut, and exhaled. He had done it. He had gone toe-to-toe with the system at its most indifferent and unyielding. And he hadn't shouted. He hadn't pleaded. He had fought with precision and law. He had reminded the court of what it had forgotten, that the law belongs to everyone. As he turned to leave, an older attorney approached from the gallery, hand extended. "Son," the man said, his voice full of awe, "that was the finest piece of lawyering I've seen in this room in 2 decades." Julian shook his hand, a quiet smile finally blooming at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted my dad's car back." He walked out of Courtroom 4B, leaving behind the wreckage of Judge Bianca Moreau's authority scattered like ashes in his wake. Back in her chambers, Moreau was trembling. Her hands shook so violently she had to rip the robe from her shoulders, casting it onto a chair like it burned. She wasn't used to this. For 20 years, she had sat in judgment. She had corrected others, shut them down, silenced them. Today, that script had been reversed, and not privately, but in front of a room full of witnesses. Her phone buzzed. A message from Judge Miller, down on the 3rd floor. "Is what I'm hearing about 4B true?" She didn't reply. She didn't have time. More messages followed, pinging one after another, the gossip mill already roaring. But the real blaze ignited at 4:30 p.m. when Marcus Liu published the story. The headline hit the legal community like a meteor. Self-represented teen dismantles Judge Moreau in open court. Reverses her ruling with Supreme Court law she overlooked. The wildfire had begun, and Julian Cross had lit it with nothing but truth. Marcus Liu's article wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was precision journalism at its most devastating. He laid out the events of that courtroom like surgical facts. The judge's open condescension, her snide dismissal of Julian's well-reasoned argument, her reliance on outdated law, and the quiet, thunderous moment when a teenager shattered her ruling with just 11 words. He quoted her directly, pulling from the official court audio. Her voice, sharp and assured, saying, "I am aware of the law, Mr. Cross," and moments later, "By all means, dazzle us," now stood in painful contrast to the reality that she had missed a critical Supreme Court ruling. The post exploded. Local media picked it up first, then national legal blogs, then the cable news cycle. It had everything: a humble underdog, an overconfident authority figure, and a perfectly cinematic reversal in the heart of a courtroom. Julian Cross was hailed as a hero, a modern David with nothing but legal textbooks and persistence to take down a Goliath in robes. Judge Bianca Moreau became a symbol, not of justice, but of the justice system's rot. Her name was now shorthand for judicial arrogance and failure. Requests for the court transcript flooded in. Civil rights groups, legal reform nonprofits, even university law professors wanted it. It became a case study, a pristine, painful illustration of everything broken in civil forfeiture and the unchecked power of judges who had forgotten their role. Less than a week later, the Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board announced it was opening a formal investigation. But it wasn't just about Julian anymore. The complaint had unearthed something deeper. Moreau's courtroom conduct was under scrutiny. Her impatience, her cutting tone, her tendency to rule from instinct rather than law. One by one, attorneys who had stayed silent for years began to speak. Her name no longer struck fear. Now it drew disdain. Her record was dissected, rulings analyzed, mistakes tallied. It wasn't long before she was summoned to appear before the board. The hearing was cold and clinical. Senior judges and ethics officials lined the panel, their faces unreadable. No deference. No, Your Honor. Just Judge Moreau, a title that suddenly felt more like a charge than a credential. They questioned her for hours. Why hadn't she read the Dawson decision? How often did she review new case law? Did she consider her treatment of Mr. Cross appropriate? She tried to defend herself. She spoke of heavy dockets, the weight of her workload, a simple lapse in oversight. But the words rang hollow, even to her. The truth clanged louder than any excuse. She had stopped growing. She had let her experience calcify into arrogance. She had forgotten that the law never sits still. A month later, the board's ruling came down. She wasn't removed from the bench, but she may as well have been. A public censure, a permanent stain on her record, an order for mandatory continuing legal education, and a reassignment to traffic court, an unspoken exile in judicial terms. Each day now, she sat beneath flickering fluorescents, presiding over expired tags, broken tail lights, and parking tickets. The same black robe, but the power was gone. Lawyers who once treated her like royalty now barely masked their contempt. She had become a cautionary tale. But fate wasn't finished with Judge Moreau. 6 months passed. The public firestorm died down, replaced by newer controversies. Julian Cross's name faded from the headlines. Judge Moreau, meanwhile, remained stuck in her new routine, a slow drip of small violations, interrupted only by the silence of her own regret. Her future, once filled with dreams of the appellate bench, was now reduced to purgatory. The only light in her life was her son, Robert. He was 22 now, a senior at the University of Illinois, studying engineering. He had no interest in law, which she had always found strangely comforting. He was kind, level-headed, and he still saw her as just Mom. That Saturday night, he came home for a visit, borrowed her car, a silver Lexus, to meet up with some friends. "I'll be back by midnight," he said, hugging her. She smiled, savoring the normalcy. At 1:30 a.m., her phone rang. It was Robert. His voice was shaky, frustrated, scared. "Mom, I've been arrested." The words hit her like ice water. "What? Arrested for what? Are you hurt? Where are you?" "I'm at the Oakmont North Precinct," he said quickly. "They said my registration was expired. It was, 2 weeks out. I forgot to put on the new sticker." She could hear the edge in his voice now, something raw, disbelieving. "But then it got weird," he continued. "They asked to search the car. I told them no. I said I know my rights. You taught me that." Her spine stiffened. Her breath caught. Then one of them, Officer Davis, said he saw something in the back seat. It was my geology hammer. For class. He said it could be a weapon. That gave them probable cause to search the whole car. The words dropped like stones into her chest. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a trap, and she knew exactly what it looked like. Pretext. Fishing. Abuse of discretion. And then, they found the money. Her pulse roared in her ears. "What money, Robert?" He hesitated. "The rent. Me and my roommates pooled our cash for next semester. It was a lot. They think I'm doing something illegal." She stood frozen, every word echoing with painful familiarity. This wasn't just happening to her son. This was Julian Cross all over again. Only this time, the court was her enemy, too. "It was almost $5,000, Robert said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "We had it in a bank envelope, just sitting in the glove box." Bianca pressed the phone to her ear, frozen. She already knew what was coming next. "They saw the cash. And everything changed," he continued. "They started grilling me, asking if I was dealing, what I was selling. I kept saying it was rent money, but they didn't believe me. Said nobody honest carries that much in cash." Bianca sank onto the edge of her bed. Her spine felt like it couldn't hold her anymore. But it wasn't just her son's voice or the panic in it. It was the phrases. Familiar phrases, bundled in a manner consistent with, highly indicative of a legal enterprise. She'd heard them. She'd written them into her own rulings. "They arrested me, Mom. Said I had a concealed weapon." "What weapon?" she asked, heart pounding now. "My geology hammer," he said hollowly. "For class. They said it could be used as a weapon. And then, they took your car." They took the Lexus. And the money. Said it's all being seized. A long silence fell. Robert spoke again, barely above a whisper. They gave me this piece of paper. Told me to go. Bianca didn't need to ask what it was. She knew. It was a receipt. A property seizure notice. The prelude to civil forfeiture proceedings. And it had her name on it. The irony pressed in like a chokehold. Her son. Her car. Her money. Caught in the jaws of the very system she had helped enforce. The same system that once devoured Julian Cross's life. And she, Bianca Moreau, had been its willing executioner for years. Now, it had turned on her. For the first time in her life, she didn't just know the law. She felt its weight. The fear. The powerlessness. The sheer absurdity of trying to prove your innocence in a system that had no interest in hearing it. The criminal charge, concealed weapon for a geology hammer, was so ridiculous it didn't survive the weekend. It was tossed out within 48 hours. But the forfeiture case? That was a different beast entirely. Bianca had to hire a defense attorney. Aaron Feldman, a sharp, seasoned lawyer who had argued before her many times, now sat across from her in his glossy downtown office, flipping through papers as she seethed. "This is ridiculous, Aaron," she snapped. "They have nothing. No drugs, no paraphernalia, no criminal history. Roberts never even had a speeding ticket." Feldman sighed, folding his hands. "You know better than anyone. They don't need anything. All they need is a narrative, a whisper of suspicion. A young man out past midnight with $5,000 in cash? That's more than enough for them." He paused. "And the burden? That's on you now. You have to prove the property's clean." Her breath caught. His words were like a mirror. She had said those very same words, too many times to count. Had watched people crumble as she told them their story wasn't enough. Their proof didn't matter. Now, she was living it. She filed the claim to contest the forfeiture, just like Julian had. Then came the waiting. Weeks passed. The 45-day deadline came and went. And then, finally, a sliver of hope. "They missed the deadline," she told Feldman, her eyes lighting up for the first time. "Dawson versus Illinois. We filed to dismiss. It's a slam dunk." But Feldman didn't smile. "We'll file it," he said gently. "But they're ready for that. Look at this." He slid his laptop around. An email was pulled up, an offer from the state. "They'll return the car," he said. "But only if you agree to forfeit half the cash, about $2,500. Bianca stared at the screen. "That's extortion," she whispered. "It's strategy," Feldman replied. "They know they're vulnerable on Dawson. So they lowball. Most people can't afford to fight back. They take the deal. It's a win for the state, either way." She was cornered. Pay Feldman more than the settlement just to prove a point, or swallow her pride and pay the system that had just stolen from her. Her voice was ice. "No. We fight." And so they did. The motion was filed. A hearing set. Civil Courtroom 4B. Her old courtroom. Bianca walked in, not through the judge's door, but through the front. No robe. No authority. Just another petitioner trying to reclaim what had been taken. She sat at the same table where Julian Cross once stood. The view from this side was sobering. The bench towered above, massive and impersonal. A shrine to indifference. Behind that bench now was Judge Peterson, young, tired, and clearly overworked. He glanced at her with zero recognition. Just another file in a long line of problems to get through. Feldman presented their motion. Cited Dawson. Clear violation of the 45-day rule. The prosecutor stumbled through a half-hearted excuse about clerical errors. Judge Peterson sighed, tapped his pen, looked up. Bianca's stomach turned. That sigh? That pen tap? That tone? She had done that. "Counsel," Peterson said flatly, "the state's conduct isn't ideal. But forcing a hearing over this seems like a questionable use of court resources, doesn't it?" He gestured to the offer. "They've proposed a settlement. Have you considered it?" Bianca felt like she was outside her own body, watching someone else live her past. But this time, she was the one being pushed. Not by ignorance, but by the very legacy she had left behind. Judge Peterson didn't care about delivering justice. He just wanted to clear another case off his overcrowded docket. To him, Bianca Moreau wasn't a citizen seeking justice. She was just another problem to move past. And in that moment, sitting at the very table where so many once pleaded their cases before her, something shifted deep inside her. She understood. She understood what it meant to face a system that prioritizes speed over truth, that values procedure more than people. She felt the crushing indifference of a legal machine that can outlast you with delays, paperwork, and cold detachment. She understood how it feels to present a clear, righteous case and be met with nothing more than a sigh and a shrug from the only person who can set things right. In her mind, she saw Julian Cross again, his poise, his resolve, the quiet strength in his voice. He hadn't just known the law. He had understood the injustice of the system in his bones. And he had used the one weapon it couldn't ignore, precision. He didn't just fight for a car. He fought for fairness. Her attorney's voice was still echoing in the background, making their final argument. But Bianca wasn't really listening anymore. Her eyes had drifted to the seal of justice behind the judge's bench, and for the first time, the blindfold didn't look like impartiality. It looked like willful ignorance. Eventually, yes, she won her motion. The law was clear. Dawson had laid it out in black and white. The court ruled in her favor, and months later, her Lexus was returned from impound. It reeked of industrial-grade air freshener and felt like a stranger. But the win rang hollow. The legal fees had bled her bank account. The sleepless nights had left her drained. The anxiety, the helplessness, the sense of being caught in a system rigged against you, it had all left its mark. She hadn't been defeated, but the system had still taken something from her. Because in this system, even when you win, you lose something. Your time, your peace of mind, your faith. And yet, out of that brutal, costly experience, she emerged with something she hadn't even realized she'd lost: clarity. A week after the court signed the final order, she sat alone in her chambers. The office was silent, the walls heavy with memories. She opened her laptop and typed 2 letters. The first was brief and formal, a resignation addressed to the chief judge of the circuit. She gave no details, no explanations, just a statement that her tenure was ending immediately, citing personal reasons. Let them whisper. Let the gossip swirl. She no longer cared. That robe, once a symbol of her authority, now felt more like a weight, something that had smothered who she truly was. The second letter was infinitely more difficult. It was addressed to Julian Cross. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking in the silence. What do you say to the person you so profoundly failed? She tried to begin, deleted the first line, started again, deleted that too. Eventually, she gave up trying to make it perfect. She wrote what was real. Dear Mr. Cross, I'm not writing you as a judge. I'm writing to you as the person who wronged you in Courtroom 4B. This apology is long overdue, not because I expect you to accept it, but because you are owed the truth. My behavior that day was inexcusable. I was arrogant, dismissive, and failed at the most basic duty of my position, to listen. You knew the law better than I did. You came prepared. You were right, and I was wrong. There's no excuse for my ignorance of a Supreme Court ruling, and even less for the way I treated you when you tried to correct me. I hid behind my title and my years on the bench, and in doing so, I committed an injustice. I won't burden you with what's happened to me since. I'll only say this: the universe has a cruel but effective way of teaching hard lessons. Recently, I was forced to stand on the other side of the system, the side you stood on. I felt what you must have felt: the helplessness, the fear, the slow, crushing grind of being unheard. It changed me. It reminded me that the law isn't just rules and precedent. It's a force that shapes lives, and when wielded without humility, it can cause real harm. I've resigned from the bench. I can't, in good conscience, continue to judge others until I've reckoned with my own failings. I don't ask for forgiveness. I only offer you my sincere regret and my deepest respect. You are an extraordinary young man. You taught me more in that courtroom than any legal seminar ever could. Sincerely, Bianca Morrow. She printed the letter on plain paper, no official seal, no trappings of authority. Just truth. She signed it, sealed it, and mailed it herself. And as the envelope slipped into the mailbox, she felt something that had eluded her for years. Peace. 2 days later, in a modest apartment across town, Julian Cross found the letter waiting in his mailbox. The return address, Oakmont Courthouse, made his chest tighten. He opened it slowly at the kitchen table. His mother watched him, brows furrowed. He read the letter once, then again, and something in him softened. The anger he'd carried since that day, hot, constant, quietly burning, began to cool. He had expected to be ignored forever. He had never expected the system to apologize. But her words weren't hollow. They didn't deflect. They didn't justify. They confessed. He felt her regret in every line. Her shame. Her transformation. Yes, he had won in court. Gotten his father's car back. Used the money to catch up on bills and start to breathe a little easier. The Mustang now sat in the driveway, restored nearly to perfection, its engine purring like it had all those years ago. But this letter, this moment, was something else. It was justice, the kind that doesn't come from a ruling or a gavel strike. The kind that lives in acknowledgement, in humility, in change. And for the first time since that day in Courtroom 4B, Julian Cross let himself smile. But even after winning, the victory had always felt unfinished. No one in authority had ever looked him in the eye and admitted the wrong. Until now. "What is it, baby?" his mother asked gently. "It's from the judge," Julian said, his voice low. He handed her the letter. She read it slowly, her expression shifting as the words sank in. By the time she reached the end, her eyes had widened, and then a knowing smile spread across her face. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. Sounds like she finally got a taste of her own medicine. Julian gave a quiet nod. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of his desk, right next to his acceptance letter to the paralegal program at Oakmont Community College. He hadn't needed an apology to validate what he'd done, but receiving it closed a door he hadn't realized was still cracked open. It didn't just mark the end of a hard chapter. It turned the memory of that fight into something complete. He turned to the window. Outside, the setting sun bathed the Mustang in warm gold, its chrome shining like armor. That car no longer represented just a link to his father. It had become a symbol of something greater, a monument to the day he discovered that the law, when understood and wielded with precision, could be more than a cage. It could be a key, and he had made a quiet vow to spend his life learning how to use that key, not just for himself, but for others who might not yet know they have the right to knock or the power to push the door open. The story of Julian Cross and Judge Bianca Morrow stands as a potent reminder. Justice isn't found in a building or in the robes of the people who preside over it. It's a living principle, one that demands attention, humility, and vigilance. Julian walked into that courtroom with nothing more than the truth on his side, and that truth turned out to be the most powerful weapon in the room. As for Judge Morrow, her story is a cautionary tale, but also a redemptive one. It teaches us that the very systems we construct can fail us, can even turn on us, and that empathy isn't a weakness in those who hold power. It's the most necessary strength of all. Thank you for watching. Subscribe me and hit the notification bell to not miss new stories. Bye.